FEMA tracks commodity supply chains as part of its national preparedness goal, and the categories flagged through supply chain resilience monitoring as facing the most significant disruption risk in 2026 are not random. 16 of them are at your grocery store right now. Number 1. Beef. Beef is the protein category most directly affected by a structural supply reduction that is not weather dependent and will not recover quickly. The USDA confirmed that the U.S. cattle herd entered 2024 at its smallest size since 1951, driven by consecutive years of drought across major ranching states that forced permanent herd liquidations rather than temporary reductions. Rebuilding a cattle herd requires at minimum 2 to 3 years of breeding cycles before any meaningful recovery shows up in meat supply volume, which means the supply constraint on beef is structural through at least 2026 and likely into 2027, regardless of how precipitation normalizes. Canned beef, freeze-dried beef, and jerky purchased now represent protein storage at prices that. Number 2. Eggs. Eggs have demonstrated through multiple avian influenza outbreak cycles since 2022 that price spikes of 50 to 100% can occur within a matter of weeks when outbreak waves hit major laying flock concentrations. The USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service has confirmed that highly pathogenic avian influenza has become an endemic seasonal threat to commercial poultry operations rather than a one-time event, and each outbreak wave requires culling infected flocks and rebuilding through a 6 to 12-month replacement cycle. Powdered whole egg products and freeze-dried egg products stored in sealed packaging represent a hedge against both the price volatility and the periodic availability gaps that fresh eggs have experienced repeatedly. Number 3. Coffee. Coffee is already in a sustained price increase cycle driven by documented crop damage in Brazil and Vietnam, which together supply approximately 60% of the world's coffee beans. The International Coffee Organization has published multiple consecutive seasonal reports documenting reduced yield projections from drought, heat stress, and erratic rainfall patterns in both major producing regions. Several major roasters have publicly announced additional price increases scheduled for the second half of 2026 in statements to trade publications, and the supply side of the coffee market shows no recovery signal that would interrupt the current pricing trajectory before those increases take effect at the retail level. Number 4. Cocoa and chocolate. Cocoa and chocolate products represent the most dramatic commodity price movement of any food category in the past 3 years, with cocoa futures prices having more than tripled between 2023 and 2025 before settling at a level still roughly double historic averages. Ivory Coast and Ghana, which together grow approximately 60% of the world's cocoa, experienced consecutive seasons of crop disease and erratic rainfall that drove the price movement, and recovery in perennial tree crops like cacao takes multiple growing seasons after conditions normalize. Baking chocolate, cocoa powder, and chocolate chips purchased now represent locking in prices at a level that is unlikely to return to pre-crisis levels within any meaningful stockpile planning window. Number 5. Olive oil. Olive oil has experienced price increases approaching or exceeding 100% in many markets from pre-drought levels, driven by consecutive severe drought seasons across Spain, Italy, and Greece that reduced Mediterranean olive harvests by 40 to 50% in the worst affected seasons. The International Olive Council has documented that the global olive oil supply deficit during the peak drought period drove prices to levels not seen in decades. And while some recovery has occurred as drought conditions have partially eased, the replanting cycles for olive trees mean that full production recovery takes years from the point when weather conditions normalize. Buying extra olive oil in larger container sizes now represents a direct hedge against a commodity that. Number 6. Orange juice. Orange juice is undergoing a structural production decline in its primary U.S. domestic source that has no near-term resolution. Florida orange production has fallen by more than 70% from its peak, according to USDA crop reports, driven by citrus greening disease, a bacterial infection spread by an invasive insect for which no commercially viable cure or disease-resistant tree variety exists at sufficient scale for commercial planting. The continuing decline in domestic production pushes more sourcing toward imported Brazilian and Mexican concentrate, whose pricing responds to exchange rates and international commodity markets in ways that domestic production did not. Shelf-stable concentrated juice products represent a way to secure current pricing on a category whose domestic supply chain is in permanent structural decline. Number 7. Pork. Pork products face upward price pressure from rising feed grain costs that have not fully resolved following the commodity price spike driven by Black Sea trade disruptions, and from ongoing labor cost pressures at processing facilities. Canned ham, canned pulled pork, and shelf-stable pork products purchased at current pricing represent a hedge against a category where input costs, including corn and soybean meal for feed, remain above historical averages and show no compelling downward trajectory that would meaningfully reduce processing costs over the near-term planning horizon. Number 8. Canned tuna and seafood. Canned tuna and canned seafood broadly face a combination of tightening global catch limits in major tuna fishing zones and ongoing tariff uncertainty on imported seafood, with the majority of canned tuna sold in the United States coming from internationally caught and processed fish. The Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission has implemented catch limit reductions in response to stock conservation concerns, and those limits reduce the raw material available to processors in ways that flow through to retail pricing on a lag of 6 to 18 months. Buying additional canned tuna and canned fish across multiple species creates a protein reserve at pricing that precedes the next round of catch limit effects reaching retail shelves. Number 9. Wheat and flour. Wheat and wheat flour face persistent uncertainty from the ongoing disruption to Black Sea grain trade that reduced Ukrainian wheat exports from pre-conflict levels. Ukraine had been one of the world's largest wheat exporters, and while trade routes and logistics have adapted partially over multiple growing seasons, the underlying supply variability from conflict zone production has not been resolved. All-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, and pasta purchased now represent a direct hedge against a commodity category whose international supply remains more volatile than domestic price stability at the retail level would suggest to most grocery shoppers. Number 10. Rice. Rice prices in international markets have responded to a combination of El Niño weather pattern effects on Asian rice production zones and to Indian government export restrictions implemented in 2023 to protect domestic food security, which reduced the supply of the lower-cost rice varieties that had historically provided a pricing floor for global markets. While U.S. domestic rice production provides partial insulation from international market dynamics, exported U.S. rice prices and the variety premiums on specialty rice types both reflect international commodity pressure. 20-pound bags of long-grain white rice purchased now represent one of the most direct and cost-effective hedges available against a staple grain whose international price structure has shifted. Number 11. Dried beans. Dried beans are facing localized production pressures from drought in the major U.S. growing regions, including the Northern Plains and the Intermountain West, where drought-driven yield reductions have affected pinto, navy, and black bean crops in multiple recent growing seasons, according to USDA crop production reports. Dried beans also benefit from the same indefinite USDA safety window as all properly stored low-acid shelf foods when sealed with oxygen absorbers, making them among the least risky items to purchase in large quantities since the storage ceiling is essentially unlimited. 10-pound bags purchased in quantity now represent a protein supply locked in at current pricing that faces genuine upward pressure from documented crop yield variability. Number 12. Dairy and powdered milk. Dairy products, including butter, cheese, and powdered milk, face input cost pressure from the same feed grain cost increases affecting pork and beef, alongside labor cost pressures at dairy processing facilities. Non-fat dry milk powder specifically, which stores for 20 to 25 years in sealed nitrogen-packed containers, represents the only dairy category where the shelf life is long enough to justify purchasing well ahead of near-term consumption needs. The LDS Church's home storage program, which serves as the longest-running continuous food storage program in the United States, specifies non-fat dry milk as one of its core storage categories, reflecting decades of institutional experience with which dairy products are genuinely practical to stockpile. Number 13. Sugar. Sugar faces upward price pressure from Indian government export restriction policies implemented in 2023 and maintained through 2024, which reduced the global supply of cane sugar from one of the world's largest producers. Brazil, which supplies a significant share of U.S. imported sugar, has also experienced weather-related variability in cane production over recent growing seasons. White sugar's indefinite shelf life when kept dry and sealed makes it one of the highest value preparedness purchases available because there is no downside storage risk, since sugar stored correctly in 2026 is as useful in 2036 as the day it was purchased. While the current price is unlikely to be lower than future prices given ongoing supply constraints. Number 14. Honey. Honey faces supply pressure from elevated domestic honeybee colony loss rates that have remained persistently above historical norms for multiple consecutive years, according to the Bee-Informed Partnership's annual surveys, alongside anti-dumping tariff actions on imported honey that have reduced the availability of lower-cost imports that previously kept domestic prices in check. Raw honey's effectively indefinite shelf life in sealed storage, documented by archaeological recoveries of edible honey from ancient Egyptian tombs, makes it the single item on this list where the argument for buying significantly more than needed in the near term is strongest, since the price risk is entirely asymmetric to the upside with essentially zero downside risk from overstocking. Number 15. Canned vegetables. Canned vegetables, specifically low-acid varieties including corn, peas, and green beans, face modest but real packaging material, cost pressures from steel can, prices that respond to broader commodity and tariff dynamics in the metals markets. The supply chain argument for canned vegetables is less dramatic than for the agricultural commodity items on this list, but the USDA confirmed indefinite safety window for properly stored low-acid canned vegetables, and the current pricing that reflects pre-full tariff impact conditions makes adding to this category now a low-risk decision with a real upside. Buying corn, peas, and green beans in case quantities now means the price paid today is the price paid for the next several years of use on a product with indefinite storage life. Number 16. Maple syrup. Maple syrup production faces a structural threat from the documented shortening and shifting of the sugaring season in the northeastern United States and Quebec as warming winter temperatures change the freeze-thaw cycling that drives sap flow. Producers in Vermont and Quebec, which together account for the overwhelming majority of global maple syrup production, have publicly reported that the optimal sugaring window has measurably narrowed over the past 2 decades, and years with compressed or late sugaring seasons translate directly into supply shortfalls and price spikes at the retail level. Pure maple syrup stores for 1 to 2 years in a pantry, and indefinitely when frozen, which means buying additional supply during a favorable production year represents a direct hedge against price spikes in years. Every category on this list has documented supply chain pressure from real sources. None of this requires speculation about what might happen. The pressure is already in the system, and retail prices are still catching up to the underlying commodity movements. Subscribe for the next video on priority rankings.